My own parents told me, repeatedly, at nearly every single family gathering for 20 long years, that I had always been far too dramatic about danger. They said it again, one final time, only 3 minutes before the building. Before the building we were all sitting in began filling with smoke. My full name is Ottiline Marlowe. I am 37 years old, and I work as an audio engineer here in Little Rock, Arkansas, mixing sound for local theater productions and the occasional civic event around the city. That day job has nothing to do with what actually happened at a town hall meeting, 18 months ago now, though people sometimes assume it does. What actually happened that night had absolutely nothing to do with my career at all, not in any real sense. It had everything to do, instead, with a habit my parents spent my whole entire life mocking, and a single night when that exact same habit saved more lives than just theirs, including their own too. Let me take you back to where that habit started. Back to a small house that nearly burned entirely down, around a 6-year-old girl nobody believed was actually paying attention. I was born Ottiline Fenn, to my parents Bexley and Anouk Fenn, in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Little Rock. When I was 6, a space heater in my bedroom shorted out in the middle of the night, and the wiring behind the wall began to smolder. It smoldered slowly, for nearly an hour, before I woke up smelling something wrong. I didn't scream right away. I got up, walked to my parents' room, and told my father, calmly, that something smelled like burning plastic. He told me to go back to bed. He said I was imagining things, that I'd had a bad dream. I went back to my room and lay awake, watching a thin line of smoke curl out from behind my dresser. It thickened, slowly, until I finally screamed loud enough for him to come see for himself. The fire department later said another 20 minutes might have changed everything. My father never once, in the years afterward, described that night as the time I saved us. He described it as the time I got lucky guessing. That framing followed me for the rest of my childhood, and honestly, for most of my adult life too. I grew up noticing things other people didn't notice. A faint smell, an unfamiliar sound, a frayed cord tucked behind a piece of furniture. I grew up learning that noticing those things out loud made me the difficult one at the table. My mother used to call me her little smoke detector, in a tone somewhere between affectionate and exasperated. It was the same tone you might use to describe a dog that barks at absolutely nothing. Over and over, in the middle of an otherwise quiet night. My father was less gentle about it, considerably less, in almost every version of the story I can remember. He called me dramatic or anxious, or, on his more irritated days, simply exhausting to be around. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to keep most of what I noticed entirely to myself, unless it felt genuinely, undeniably urgent, because raising it always cost more socially than simply staying quiet ever did. I should say something about my parents themselves. It would be too easy, otherwise, to describe them only through the worst version of their behavior. My father worked 32 years as a supervisor at a shipping distribution center. That job rewarded a very particular kind of confidence, the ability to make quick decisions under pressure and never visibly second-guess yourself in front of a room full of employees. My mother taught elementary school for almost as long. That job demanded endless patience with small emergencies, ones that mostly turned out to be nothing at all. Skinned knees, lost lunchboxes, imagined monsters under desks. I sometimes wonder whether both of their careers quietly trained them the same way. To treat any expressed worry as something to manage and minimize, rather than something worth actually investigating, since that instinct served them well enough in every other part of their lives. There was a period, in my late 20s, before I met Merritt, when I actually tried to train myself out of the habit entirely. I was exhausted by decades of being the family worrier, and wanted, for once, to simply exist in a room without cataloging its exits. I dated someone during that period who found my noticing charming at first, then eventually tiresome. It was almost exactly the same register my father always used. I remember consciously suppressing an observation about a gas smell in his apartment building, because I didn't want to be that woman again, the dramatic one, the difficult one. Nothing happened that time, thankfully. No fire, no emergency, just a landlord who fixed the issue on his own schedule, a few weeks later. But I remember the suppression itself clearly, the specific effort it took to talk myself out of trusting something I knew, deep down, was real. I want to be honest about something before I go further into this story. I did not grow up thinking of myself as especially brave or especially perceptive. I grew up thinking of myself as someone whose instincts embarrassed the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. That's a strange, quiet kind of wound to carry, different from the more obvious betrayals people usually talk about on this channel. Nobody hit me. Nobody abandoned me. My parents simply, consistently, for decades, treated the one trait that had already saved their lives once as an inconvenient personality flaw. Something to be managed and gently mocked, rather than respected. I want to tell you about one more incident from that same era, since I think it illustrates the pattern even more clearly than the space heater did. When I was 9, our family took a road trip to visit relatives in Tennessee, and about 2 hours into the drive, I noticed a faint burning smell coming from somewhere near the dashboard vents. I mentioned it. My father told me it was probably just dust burning off the heater coils, completely normal, and turned the radio up slightly, a small gesture that felt, even at 9, like a door quietly closing on the conversation. 40 minutes later, smoke began seeping visibly from under the hood. We pulled over on the shoulder of the interstate and found a wiring harness had partially melted against the engine block. Nobody was hurt. My father laughed about it at dinner that same night, calling it a funny scare, and never once mentioned that I'd been the one to notice it first, 40 minutes before anyone else could see it with their own eyes. I remember a specific evening, when I was maybe 11, that I still think about often. We were at my grandmother's house for a holiday dinner, and I noticed the stove's pilot light burning an unusual color, a thin thread of orange where it should have been mostly blue. I mentioned it, quietly, to my mother. She waved me off without even looking, telling me to go find something useful to do, instead of hovering around the kitchen making everyone nervous. My grandmother, overhearing, actually did check the stove later that night, after everyone had gone home, and found a minor gas leak the utility company confirmed and repaired within the week. Nobody ever mentioned that evening again. Not once, not even as a small credit to the 11-year-old who'd noticed it first. College gave me my first real distance from that house, and I chose a state school 4 hours away mostly for that reason, though I told my parents it was about the scholarship. I studied audio engineering almost by accident, drawn to a required elective in sound design. It turned out to be the first class where paying close, careful attention to small details was treated as a genuine asset, rather than an exhausting quirk. My professor used to say a good engineer catches the problem before the room even notices it exists. That sentence landed differently for me than it seemed to land for my classmates. I remember sitting in that lecture hall, thinking that description had already applied to me. For 15 years, just never in a context anyone had bothered to reward. Before merit, I should mention, there was a long stretch of my early 20s. A stretch where I dated no one at all, mostly by choice. I threw myself into freelance mixing work, telling my parents, whenever they asked, that I simply hadn't met the right person yet. The truth was quieter than that. I was tired, in ways I didn't fully have language for at the time. Tired of explaining myself to people who found my vigilance charming for exactly as long as it stayed abstract, and grading the moment it became inconvenient in any real, specific situation. I met my husband, Merritt, at a community theater production I was mixing sound for, back when I was 24 and just starting out professionally. He was building sets that season. I remember him noticing, on our third or fourth conversation, that I always seemed to know exactly where every exit in the building was without ever having been told to check. He asked me about it, genuinely curious rather than teasing. I told him the short version of the story, the space heater, my father's dismissal, the habit that had followed me ever since. He didn't laugh. He said it sounded less like anxiety and more like a skill nobody had ever properly thanked me for. I married a man who saw that distinction clearly. I think it mattered more than I realized at the time, since it was the first time anyone in my adult life had described my vigilance as a strength, rather than a burden. Our wedding itself was small, held at a botanical garden Merritt had chosen specifically because I loved the greenhouse there, an irony neither of us fully appreciated until years later. My parents attended, and my father, during his toast, made a joke about how he hoped Merritt had a good smoke detector installed, since he was marrying into a family of worriers. The room laughed. I laughed too, because that's what you do at your own wedding, even when a joke lands somewhere tender. Merritt didn't laugh. He found my hand under the table and held it. He still does that, the same way, whenever my parents say something like that in front of other people. Over the years, that's been often enough that the gesture has become its own quiet language between us. I want to pause here, before I take you into that night. I want to tell you something about what that vigilance actually feels like to carry into adulthood. I don't think most people who haven't lived it fully understand the texture of it. It isn't constant fear. Most days, most rooms, most ordinary errands pass without my noticing anything at all worth mentioning. It's more like a low, quiet hum running underneath everything else, a kind of background awareness that occasionally, rarely, sharpens into something specific enough to require action. Learning to trust that sharpening, after 30 years of being told it wasn't real, took its own kind of quiet work. Private work, mostly, that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of me at all. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've ever had a real, useful instinct treated as a character flaw by the people who should have valued it most, stay with me. The part of this story that changes everything happened 18 months ago, in a room I never expected to matter this much. Before I go further, though, I have a question for you, since this channel exists because people like you keep showing up for stories exactly like mine. Has someone in your life ever dismissed an instinct of yours that later turned out to be exactly right? Tell me about it in the comments. Every single message gets read, and I believe those instincts deserve real recognition, even here, even from a stranger. Before I tell you about that night, I want to tell you about a smaller moment that happened just 2 weeks earlier, one that I didn't think much of at the time, but that I've turned over often since. Merritt and I were having dinner at my parents' house, an ordinary Sunday evening. My father mentioned, offhand, something about the community center, the one where the rezoning meeting would be held. It had been having some kind of electrical trouble, the kind the building manager couldn't quite pin down. He said it the way you'd mention a minor inconvenience, a flickering light, a breaker that tripped more than it should. I remember feeling something small and familiar tighten in my chest, the same feeling I'd learned, over 30 years, to keep mostly to myself at that particular table. I asked, carefully, whether anyone had actually had an electrician look at it properly. My father waved the question away, the same gesture he'd used my entire life, and changed the subject to the rezoning itself. The building was a converted community center on the west side of Little Rock, nearly 70 years old. It had a town hall meeting scheduled about a proposed rezoning, one that had half the neighborhood arguing for months beforehand. My parents lived 2 streets over and had strong opinions about the rezoning. Strong enough that they asked me to come along, mostly, I think, because my father liked having an audience when he spoke at these things. I agreed, partly out of habit, partly because Merritt had a late rehearsal that night and I didn't feel like sitting home alone. I remember walking into that building and doing the thing I always do without quite deciding to do it. Scanning the exits, noting where the fire extinguishers hung, clocking the slightly uneven smell of the air near the old boiler room door. I want to describe the room itself a little more, since the small details of it matter to everything that happened afterward. The community center had a high, drop-tile ceiling, the kind common in buildings from that era. A single set of double doors marked the main entrance, flanked by 2 smaller emergency exits, one on each side wall. The boiler room sat behind an unmarked door near the back left corner. Easy to miss, unless you were the kind of person who automatically noted every door in a room the moment you walked into it. I was exactly that kind of person, and I had noted it, along with everything else, within about 90 seconds of arriving. The meeting itself started ordinarily enough. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A folding table up front where 3 city council members sat, looking mildly exhausted. A local news crew set up a single camera near the back to live stream the proceedings for residents who couldn't attend in person. My parents sat near the front, the way they always did at these things, wanting to be seen taking their civic duties seriously. I sat a few rows back with a neighbor I knew slightly, half listening to the opening remarks, half doing what I always do in unfamiliar rooms, cataloging details Nobody else seemed to be tracking at all. About 20 minutes into the meeting, I noticed it. A faint, acrid smell, different from the usual musty community center smell, coming from somewhere near the boiler room door I'd clocked on my way in. I sat up straighter. Nobody else around me seemed to react at all. I leaned over to my neighbor and asked, quietly, if she smelled anything unusual. She shook her head, distracted, focused on the council member currently speaking about traffic projections. I told myself, for a moment, to let it go, the way I'd trained myself to let things go for 30 years. Then the smell sharpened, unmistakably now, into something closer to burning insulation. Every instinct I'd spent my whole life being mocked for started firing at once. I stood up. I walked, calmly but quickly, toward the boiler room door near the side of the building. I want to tell you honestly that some small, exhausted part of me expected to be wrong. Expected to find nothing and walk back to my seat, quietly absorbing another version of the same old joke. I was not wrong. Smoke was curling out from under the boiler room door, thin but steadily thickening. When I touched the door handle with the back of my hand, the way you're supposed to check before opening anything during a fire, it was warm enough to make my stomach drop entirely. New here? Then you should know one thing about how these stories tend to go. A moment like this rarely stays contained to just one door for long. I promise you it didn't, not that night. Subscribe if you want to hear exactly what happened in the next 4 minutes. What happened is the reason a room full of strangers eventually saw footage of me. Footage neither I nor my parents ever expected the world to watch. I want to slow down here for just a moment, truly. I've replayed these next few seconds more times than any other part of this entire story, and I think the details matter. The handle was warm, not hot, and that told me something specific. The fire was still relatively contained, still building rather than raging, which meant there was still time to move people out calmly. Time enough to avoid triggering the kind of panic that gets people trampled in a crowded room. That distinction, calm evacuation versus panicked stampede, is something I'd read about specifically in the fire safety materials I mentioned earlier, and it shaped every single decision I made in the 4 minutes that followed. I did not open that door. Opening a door with active fire behind it can feed the flames oxygen and create exactly the kind of flashover that kills people. It's a fact I happen to know from years of quietly reading fire safety materials. Materials nobody in my family ever understood why I bothered with. Instead, I turned around and walked, fast now, back toward the front of the room. I said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, that there was a fire starting in the boiler room, and that everyone needed to evacuate immediately, calmly, through the main doors. For one long, terrible second, nobody moved. A council member actually asked me to wait until public comment. My father, from his seat near the front, said, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that I was being dramatic again. I did not have time to argue with him. I walked directly to the fire alarm pull station mounted near the main entrance, the one I'd clocked automatically on my way in, without ever deciding to memorize its location, and I pulled it. The alarm was loud enough that argument became impossible. People began moving, slowly at first. Faster, once the first thin wisp of visible smoke reached the ceiling near the boiler room wall. I stayed near the front, directing the flow toward the main doors. I physically redirected a man who tried to head toward a side exit, one I knew was blocked by stacked folding tables. My mother, near the middle of the crowd, was moving slowly, favoring a knee that had been bothering her for months. I pushed through people to reach her, took her arm, and walked her out myself, faster than she could have managed alone. A woman near the back, elderly, using a cane, had frozen entirely, overwhelmed by the sudden noise and movement. I remember veering toward her instinctively, taking her free arm and walking her the last stretch to the doors myself, before circling back for anyone else still inside. She thanked me weeks later, tracking down my number through the news station, and told me she'd frozen exactly the same way once before, decades earlier. During a different emergency, nobody had helped her through in time. She said having someone simply take her arm without asking permission first, without wasting the seconds a polite question would have cost, was the only reason she'd made it out calmly instead of panicking further. I want to mention one more person from that night. A young man I didn't know, standing near the middle of the room, froze completely when the alarm sounded, staring at his phone as though it might explain what was happening better than his own eyes could. I grabbed his sleeve on my way past and told him firmly to move toward the doors. He snapped out of it immediately, later thanking me in a message through the news station. He said he'd never experienced that kind of total mental blank before and hadn't known what to do with it. My father was the last person I physically had to redirect. He was standing near his chair, phone out, trying to film the smoke instead of leaving. I grabbed his arm, hard enough to genuinely startle him, and told him, in a voice I don't think I'd ever used with him before, that he needed to move immediately, or I was leaving him in that building. He moved. Everyone made it out. The fire department arrived within 6 minutes and contained the fire to the boiler room and an adjacent storage closet. The building itself was closed for repairs for nearly 4 months afterward. I remember standing outside on the curb in the cold, watching firefighters go in and out with their equipment, feeling the strange, delayed shaking that always seems to arrive only once genuine danger has actually passed. Nobody was seriously hurt. An investigation later determined the fire started from exactly the kind of aging electrical wiring. The kind I'd spent 30 years of my life being mocked for noticing. In other places, in other rooms, at other family gatherings nobody ever wanted to hear about. The local news crew's single camera had kept rolling through the entire evacuation, positioned near the back exactly where it needed to be to capture almost everything. My walk toward the boiler room door, my announcement to the room, the fire alarm. The moment I redirected the man toward the blocked exit, my mother's slow walkout on my arm, my father's phone still raised as I pulled him toward the door. The station aired an edited version on the 11 o'clock news that night. By the next morning, a longer clip surfaced too, unedited this time. A handful of regional outlets covering local emergency response picked it up. If this part of the story is landing the way I hope it is, I want to pause and remind you why this channel exists at all. It's for people who have spent years being quietly dismissed for the exact thing that eventually mattered most. Subscribe if a story like mine means something to you, because there's another true story here almost every single day, and I promise you, Mine isn't finished yet. Merritt met me at the hospital that night, since the fire department had insisted everyone get checked for smoke inhalation as a precaution, even though none of us had visible injuries. He found me sitting on a gurney in a hallway, still in the clothes I'd worn to the meeting, smelling faintly of smoke. He didn't ask me a single question about what happened. He simply held me for a long moment, the way you hold someone after you've realized, all at once, how differently the night could have gone. My parents were checked out in a different section of the same emergency room. I remember catching sight of my father through a gap in the curtains, sitting very still, staring at nothing, in a way I had never once seen him sit before. In the immediate aftermath, before any of the records requests or reporter interviews began, there was simply a strange, quiet week where our whole family moved through ordinary routines as though nothing had happened, while everyone privately processed something enormous. Merritt went back to his rehearsal schedule. My father went back to work. I found myself, oddly, unable to focus on any of my own mixing projects that week. I kept replaying the sequence of the evacuation over and over, checking and rechecking small details in my memory again and again. The way you might reread a contract, looking for something you missed the first time around. A local reporter, working on a follow-up piece about the fire, filed a public records request with the city a few days later. Mostly, she told me afterward, out of routine curiosity about the building's maintenance history. What she found became its own small story entirely separate from the fire itself. 3 years earlier, I had attended a different community event in that same building, a neighborhood association meeting, and had noticed, then too, the smell of something faintly electrical near that same boiler room wall. I had filed a formal complaint with the city's code enforcement office at the time, in writing, describing exactly what I'd noticed and asking for an inspection. The complaint was logged, assigned a case number, and closed 11 days later, marked unable to substantiate, with a note from an inspector who had apparently done a brief walkthrough and found nothing conclusive. The reporter found that complaint sitting in the public record, 3 years old, my own name attached to it plainly. It described almost exactly the failure that eventually started the fire, word for word, in language I barely recognized writing myself. She called me for comment. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my ear, feeling something complicated settle into my chest that wasn't quite vindication and wasn't quite anger either. I had been right 3 years earlier, too. Nobody had listened then either. It had simply taken longer and a bigger fire for the pattern to finally become undeniable to anyone outside my own family. The reporter, whose name was Naomi, called me a second time about a week after her original piece ran, this time with a different kind of question entirely. She told me the station had been getting calls and messages from viewers ever since the story aired. People describing their own version of the same pattern, an instinct dismissed for years by someone who loved them, a warning ignored until it finally stopped being ignorable. She asked if I'd be willing to do a short follow-up interview, specifically about that response. I agreed, mostly for one reason. Hearing I wasn't the only one who'd lived this made a real difference. It made the whole ordeal feel a good deal less isolating than it had felt up to that point. The interview aired on a Sunday morning segment, longer and quieter than the initial news coverage had been, and I remember trying, in it, to describe the specific texture of growing up second guessed. Not abused, not neglected in any way a caseworker would have flagged, simply mocked, consistently, for the one trait that turned out to matter most. Naomi asked me, near the end of the segment, a direct question. What would I say to a parent watching, one who recognized themselves in what I'd just described? I told her I didn't have a tidy answer, but that noticing your child's instincts, even the inconvenient ones, costs so much less than the alternative eventually did for my own family. My father called me 2 days after the story ran, the follow-up piece with my old complaint included. I braced myself, honestly, for another version of the same old joke, softened slightly by circumstance but fundamentally unchanged. That is not what happened. He stayed silent on the phone for a long stretch, longer than I'd ever known him to go without filling that silence with something. Then he said something, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from him in years. He'd watched the news footage of himself standing there, filming smoke instead of moving. More times than he wanted to admit, and that he didn't recognize the man in that footage as someone who deserved to have been trusted with my safety for 31 years. I didn't know what to say to that, so for a while I said nothing at all. We simply sat on the phone together, in a silence that felt different from every other silence we'd shared before. Eventually, I told him that I appreciated him saying it, which was true. I also told him, honestly, one phone call didn't undo 3 decades. 3 decades of being called dramatic every time I mentioned something felt wrong. He said he understood that. I believed him, for the first time in a long time, that he actually did. My brother, Callan, 4 years younger than me and living in Memphis, called me after seeing the news clip shared online by a mutual friend, someone neither of us had spoken to in years. He told me he'd watched it 3 times in a row, and that somewhere in the second viewing he'd started crying, quietly, alone in his apartment, remembering his own version of growing up in that house. He wasn't the anxious one, he said. He was the one who'd learned, watching me get mocked for noticing things, to simply stop noticing anything at all, to keep his head down and avoid becoming a target the same way I had become one. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, longer than we'd talked in years. I think it was the first time either of us had described our childhood plainly. Using the same honest language, instead of the softened, joking version our family had always preferred. I want to tell you about one more conversation before I get to my mother's response. It changed how I think about this whole story, more than almost anything else that happened afterward. Naomi, the reporter, asked me something during our second interview. Whether I'd ever considered that the city's dismissal of my original complaint 3 years earlier might have been its own small betrayal, separate entirely from anything my parents had done. I hadn't until she asked. I'd spent so many years focused on the private, familial version of being dismissed. I hadn't fully registered the public, institutional version of that exact same pattern, playing out through an inspector I'd never even met, in a system I'd trusted, reasonably, to take a written complaint seriously. My mother's response was different, quieter, more physical than verbal. In the days right after the fire, she barely spoke to me about it at all. She deflected whenever I brought it up. Changing the subject with a practiced ease One I recognized from 30 years of watching her do exactly that whenever a conversation threatened to go somewhere uncomfortable. I didn't push her. I'd learned, over the years, that pushing my mother rarely opened anything. It mostly just made her retreat further behind whatever pleasant, deflecting sentence she'd already chosen. A week after the fire, she asked me to come over and walk through her and my father's own house with her, room by room. The way I used to do instinctively as a child, before anyone ever told me to stop. I found an outdated smoke detector in the hallway, its battery so old it had corroded slightly inside the casing, a small failure sitting in plain sight for who knows how long. I found a space heater in my father's home office, the cord frayed exactly the way the one in my childhood bedroom had been frayed 31 years earlier, in the room where all of this really started. She followed me quietly from room to room that afternoon, saying almost nothing, occasionally handing me a screwdriver or holding a flashlight steady when I needed a free hand. My mother stood in the doorway watching me catalog all of it. When I finished, she said something quiet. She was sorry it had taken almost losing everyone in that community center for her to finally let me look. The city itself, separate from anything to do with my family, went through its own reckoning in the weeks that followed. The council member who had told me to wait for public comment resigned from a subcommittee. The emergency preparedness won, quietly, without a formal statement. The city's code enforcement office announced a review of all complaints closed as unable to substantiate over the previous 5 years, a process that eventually reopened 11 cases, 3 of which resulted in genuine safety violations being corrected months later. I didn't ask for any of that to happen. I mentioned it to Naomi once, almost apologetically, as though I'd caused some administrative avalanche I hadn't intended, and she told me, kindly, that I hadn't caused anything. I had simply been right, publicly and undeniably, in a way the system finally couldn't dismiss. The weeks after the fire were strange in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Local reporters wanted follow-up interviews. A city council member publicly thanked me at the next town hall meeting, held in a different building entirely, one with newer wiring and clearer signage on every exit. The applause that followed felt oddly disorienting, strange in a way I hadn't quite braced myself for. 31 years of being quietly told the opposite reaction was the correct one will do that to a person. It takes a long, patient while, I've learned, to fully unlearn something that old. That second meeting, the one where the council member thanked me publicly, was held in a rented church fellowship hall 3 blocks from the original community center, since repairs there were still months from finished. I remember sitting in a folding chair very similar to the one I'd sat in the night of the fire. My pulse climbed slightly as the meeting opened, an echo of vigilance my body apparently hadn't fully released yet, even in a room with no boiler, no smoke, nothing actually wrong at all. Merritt noticed and put his hand over mine without saying anything, the same quiet gesture from our wedding, still doing exactly the same work it had always done. Merritt came with me to that meeting and sat beside me. Afterward, in the car, he told me he'd never been prouder of anything in his life. Though he also said, gently, that he wished it hadn't taken a fire and a room full of strangers for my own parents to finally say something similar. Merritt and I have talked about this, since then, about whether we'd have handled anything differently if we'd known ahead of time what that night would hold. He says no, that he wouldn't change a single decision I made in that room, and that watching the footage afterward only confirmed something he'd believed about me since our very first conversation at that theater years earlier. I've told him, honestly, that some nights I still replay one moment: the council member asking me to wait for public comment. I wonder, sometimes, what would have happened if I'd been a slightly different version of myself. One more easily silenced by a man in an official capacity, telling her to sit back down. There is a version of this story where the fire is the only turning point, where everything before it was simply 31 years of the same unbroken pattern, and everything after it was a clean, uncomplicated correction. That version would be easier to tell, and easier for you to watch, but it wouldn't be honest. So I want to slow down here and tell you about the messier middle instead. The weeks where nothing was resolved yet, and everyone in my family was simply sitting, awkwardly, with a version of themselves they hadn't expected to have to look at so directly. I want to tell you about something that happened about 2 months after the fire, something smaller than the evacuation itself, but somehow just as significant to me. My father asked if he could take me to lunch, alone, without my mother, which had never once happened in my entire adult life. We sat across from each other at a diner near his house. He told me, haltingly, about his own father, my grandfather, a man who had apparently mocked every worry my father ever raised as a child too. Calling him soft, calling him nervous, the exact same language my father had spent decades using on me, without ever once connecting the two. He said he thought he'd been trying, his whole life, to prove he wasn't soft either. Somewhere along the way, without ever meaning to, he'd started doing to me exactly what had been done to him. He also told me, that same lunch, about a moment from his own childhood I'd never heard before. When he was around 10, apparently, he'd noticed a strange rattling sound coming from the family car's engine. He mentioned it to his father, my grandfather, who told him, in almost the exact words my father would later use on me, that he was imagining things. 2 weeks after that, the car broke down on a rural highway at night, stranding the whole family for hours until a passing truck driver stopped to help. My father said he'd never once, in 60 years, connected that memory to what he did to me, until he sat with it deliberately, for the first time, in the weeks after the fire. I did not fully forgive him over that lunch. I want to be plain about that, here and now. Rather than give you a version of this story that wraps up more neatly than real families actually do. But I understood him a little better afterward. Understanding someone doesn't erase what they did, but sometimes it makes the weight of it slightly more bearable to keep carrying. We have lunch now, just the two of us, once a month, always at the same quiet diner. A habit that started awkwardly and has slowly, gradually, become something neither of us actually wants to give up. There's a detail from that lunch I haven't mentioned yet, one that has stayed with me longer, honestly, than almost anything else he said that day. Near the end, my father asked me something, quietly. Whether I remembered the exact words he'd used on the phone, the night of the space heater, all those years ago. I told him I did, word for word, the way you remember the specific sentences that shape you. He asked me to say them back to him. I did, and I watched him absorb it. His own old dismissal, spoken back in his adult daughter's voice, across a diner table, decades later. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded slowly and said that hearing it out loud, finally, from someone he actually had to look in the eye, landed different than simply remembering it privately ever had. Before I share the last few things this whole experience taught me, I want to say clearly why this channel matters, both to me and, I hope, to you too. It exists for people who show up and listen all the way through stories like mine. If tonight's story reminded you of your own quiet instincts, the ones someone else in your life has never fully respected, subscribe and stay a while, because there's always another story here waiting for you. My brother Callan flew in from Memphis for that same anniversary weekend, something he hadn't done for an ordinary visit in years. I think all three of us understood, without saying so directly, that the date itself had become a kind of quiet marker for our family. A line between who we'd been before and who we were still figuring out how to be afterward. A year after the fire, almost to the day, my parents invited all of us over for what my mother called a small dinner, nothing formal, just family. When we arrived, I noticed something before I even said hello. A new carbon monoxide detector, mounted properly in the hallway, and a fire extinguisher hanging in a bracket beside the kitchen. Exactly the kind of small, unglamorous safety measure I'd suggested 100 times over the years, without anyone ever installing so much as a spare battery. My father saw me notice it. Instead of brushing past the moment, the way he always used to, he simply said, quietly, that he'd finally gotten around to it, and that he hoped it wasn't too late for that to mean something. I told him it wasn't too late, and I genuinely meant that. I also told him, honestly, that meaning something and fixing everything were two entirely different things, and that I was still working out which of those this particular gesture actually was. He nodded, and didn't argue with me, which itself felt like its own small kind of progress, since arguing with my discomfort used to be the very first thing he reached for. There are a few things I've come to believe since that night, and I want to leave them with you plainly, the way I wish someone had left them with me 31 years ago. The first is this. An instinct that keeps proving itself right over decades is not anxiety, no matter how many times someone with more social power than you insists otherwise. There is a real, meaningful, measurable difference between genuine vigilance and unfounded worry, even when the two look nearly identical from the outside, in the moment, to someone who isn't the one carrying either of them. The people who benefit most from collapsing that distinction, honestly, are almost always the same people. The ones who don't especially want to change their own careless habits in the first place. The second thing I believe is simple to state, though it took me years to actually believe it about myself. Being mocked for a trait that once already saved everyone's life is one of the strangest, most disorienting forms of dismissal there is. It's disorienting precisely because the proof already existed the whole time. Sitting quietly in a bedroom that nearly burned down when I was 6 years old, waiting decades for anyone to finally take it seriously. My parents were not cruel people, not in any broad sense. They loved me in their limited, careless way the entire time. They were also quietly teaching me, at the very same time, that my most useful instinct was something to apologize for. Both of those things were true at once, entirely, side by side, uncomfortably, without ever quite canceling each other out the way I sometimes wish they would. I don't think you have to fully resolve that contradiction, to still name it plainly and honestly, out loud, the way I'm naming it here tonight. The third thing, and maybe the one that matters most out of everything I've told you tonight, is that vindication rarely arrives as a clean, satisfying victory the way you might imagine it beforehand. I did not feel triumphant standing in that smoky hallway, redirecting strangers toward an exit while my own father filmed smoke instead of moving. I felt terrified and furious and completely certain, all at the same time. The exact thing I'd been punished for, my whole life, was the reason. The only reason everyone in that room was about to survive the next 10 minutes. The fourth point is a smaller one in scope, but it has stayed with me just as long as any of the others I've already mentioned tonight. Repair does not require the person who hurt you to fully understand it right away. My father is still learning, slowly, patiently, what 31 years of that particular habit actually cost me, and I don't think, honestly, he'll ever fully finish learning it, not completely. What matters more, I've come to believe, is whether someone keeps trying anyway, once they finally start. Even imperfectly, even slowly, even decades later than any of us would have chosen, if we'd had any real say in the timing of it. I think about Callan often when I think about this last lesson, since his version of surviving that house looked so different from mine, quieter, more invisible, and in some ways harder to spot from the outside. He didn't get a fire, or a live stream, or a public reckoning to force anyone's hand. He simply carried his own version of the same old dismissal privately, for years. Until a news clip, shared by a stranger, finally gave him permission to say it out loud too. I think about how many people are still carrying versions of this, ones that never get a dramatic moment at all. I hope, whenever I tell this story, that some of them find their own quieter permission in it anyway. And here is the very last point, the one I keep circling back to. Repair, when it comes, often arrives smaller and slower than the wound that made it necessary. A quiet lunch once a month. A mother finally letting you check her smoke detectors. A father admitting something, in a voice you'd never heard him use before. That he no longer recognized the man in the footage, holding up his phone instead of moving. None of that undoes 31 years, not fully, not entirely, and I don't pretend otherwise to myself or to you. But it is, I've come to believe, sincerely, still worth having, still worth showing up for, one small correction at a time, one quiet monthly lunch at a time. I don't know exactly what the next chapter of my relationship with my parents looks like, and I've stopped trying to predict it with any real confidence. What I do know is this. The version of me who sat quietly through 31 years, being called dramatic over and over, no longer exists in quite the same way. I don't think she's coming back, not fully, not after that room filled with smoke and I finally understood, all at once, what my own instincts had actually been worth the entire time. I keep a small, plain notebook now, something Merritt gently suggested a few months after the fire, where I write down, whenever it happens, a moment my instincts notice something before anyone else did. It's a strange, quiet record to keep, mostly for myself. I've shown it to my father once, though, and he sat with it for a long time. He flipped through pages that documented, in small dated entries, exactly how often that habit of mine had actually been right. Over years, he'd mostly stopped paying attention to. If any part of this landed with you tonight, leave a comment below. Tell me about an instinct of yours, one that someone else dismissed for years, that turned out, eventually, against all their doubt, to be exactly right. I read every single one, always, and I genuinely think they deserve to be named clearly, the exact same way I've finally, fully named mine here tonight. Thank you, truly and sincerely, for staying with me through this one tonight. All the way from the very beginning to this last quiet line at the end. I will see you again very soon, I truly hope, in the next quiet story waiting here for you.